Good evening, I'm Isaac BenEzra, host and co-producer of Conversations. It gives me great pleasure to introduce somebody I've gotten to know, particularly at the farmers market. He happens to be a retired professor, professor emeritus or emeritus or what? Emeritus. You can tell I'm not from the academic background. At any rate, Jules is one of the jewels, literally, in our community. It's amazing, as a result of my doing conversations, what I've uncovered in the way that the undeniable talent that exists, that's just there in the community that we live in. So when you see Jules at the farmer's market, although he may eat spinach like you, he possesses talents that really demand having the opportunity to get to know better. Jules is a Bronzeville boy, meaning he came from Brooklyn.
Indeed.
And I lived on the other side of that East River and lived in Manhattan on the Lower East Side. Both of those communities were enclaves for Jewish immigrants.
Correct.
Probably your parents were born somewhere else.
Absolutely.
And my parents were born somewhere else. Right. And when did they come to America?
My mother came about 1908, I would think. My grandfather, her father, had always wanted to own land. He was a cattle trader, dealer in Poland, not far from Lublin. And he always wanted to own land, but couldn't because he was Jewish. But at the turn of the century, there was a Jewish philanthropist named de Hirsch, Baron de Hirsch. After the Dreyfus affair in France, he was French, which started impulse for a certain kind of Zionism. He had the same impulse to settle Jews on the land. So he started some communal groups in Palestine, Argentina, and Woodbine, New Jersey, down in the South Jersey. And my grandfather came and had a little dairy farm, and that he brought over his family. My father came in 1913 from the Russian side of the Russian-Polish border, and he joined an older brother. So that's where they came from.
And they settled in Brooklyn immedially, or were they?
In Brooklyn, Williamsburg immediately.
Williamsburg.
You mentioned Lower East Side. When that became overcrowded, in fact, well, it was.
I know.
As you well know, I think in the 1890s, it was the highest tuberculosis rate in the world outside of Calcutta, the highest density of population. So they went over the bridge into Williamsburg. But then we wound up ultimately through various circumstances to Crown Heights and then to Brownsville and Ocean Hill, Brownsville. And I went to Brooklyn College, Brooklyn Technical High School and Brooklyn College, graduated in 1950 and went off to Minnesota graduate school and never lived in New York again except temporarily.
And you wound up here at UMass in the 70s, early
1958.
You go back that far?
I do indeed.
Now, was there a union movement at that time, or was that?
No, absolutely not.
Something that was yet to come?
It was yet to come.
Tell me about that, just briefly.
It's hard to be brief about it, but I guess I have to, like most political and organizational things, there's a personal dimension. And the line between the personal and the political, you know, that cliche of the 60s, gets blurred. But I had been in Europe. I was a director of the exchange program UMass had with Freiburg University in 1976, 77. When I came back, that was when they were trying to organize the union. The early days of the early 70s was the OPEC crisis. So for 4 years, there were no raises. And it looked like the university was going over the Niagara Falls without a barrel, as they used to say in our meetings. And they started to organize. I got back in '77, and my mother came up from there. She was Alzheimer's and taken care of her for 3 years. And during those years, I had left the Massachusetts Review in 1974. I was recruited. They needed a full professor, kind of a front man. Bruce Laurie, a wonderful historian, labor historian at the university, and organizer for the Mass Teachers Association, Jack Polidori, two dear friends of mine, found me one day having a drink at the campus center with Mike Thelwell and somebody else, Craig Edwards, whose wife was Lee Edwards, a dear friend, who became dean at the university. Anyway, the organizer looked at me with a gleam in his eye, and he recruited me to help the organizing drive and the bargaining collective. So we did for 3 years, and I was in the final bargaining sessions, 2 weekends of 40 hours each in Boston, and we got the contract, our first contract in 1980, and then they elected me president. There had been 2 presidents before. So I was in at the beginning of the union, and it was very, what can I say? I think it was a great victory to get the contract. I've never been so elated. There were 4 of us in the final negotiation with 4 members from UMass Boston. And then the presidency was exhilarating in some respects. I never had such highs in my life, but also never had such lows. Because you had to fight the administration.
You were the point man.
Yeah, and you had to deal with your own faculty, you know. You have 1,200 faculty members of the university. If you said the sun will rise tomorrow, 500 people would object. We don't know. So you had to, a very ordinary university faculty, contentious. And
but
you had
how did that
opposition.
impact in terms of really establishing UMass as an educational institution?
Well, it's a good question. I think we were among the very few universities of higher education to be organized. And others tried, and some succeeded, in Illinois and Vermont. But then the Brandeis Act forbade organizing in private institutions because they said that faculty members were really part of management, which is nonsense. But within the university itself, I think it increased the morale terrifically, kept people at the university when things looked like they were going downhill. It made the cohesion and empowerment for the faculty. And I think we had some very good years, and very wonderful people were recruited, and so on and so on. Altogether very positive. And beside that, we also became very close to the staff, the secretarial people, the clerks, the professional people who we organized together. So it was an enlargement of our sensibilities and our empathy and sympathies right across the line. So it was, in my view, in that sense, it was an excellent educational experience. And I think it filtered down in the way people taught their classes and so on.
Coming back to your own development, in addition to your work in bringing a union to town, how did you get involved in Jewish literature? When did that start? The Shula?
Good question.
Was it the Shula?
No. My family were Orthodox. They weren't, I wasn't a red diaper baby at all, although I had an uncle who read, there were 3 major Yiddish newspapers. One was the Tug, which was basically conservative, religious in a sense. Second was the Freiheit, was the communist paper, Freedom. And the third was the Forward, or Vorwärts, edited by Abraham Kahn, about whom I wrote a book about his fiction. And that was social democratic. And my father read the conservative paper, and my 2 uncles, one read the socialist paper and the other read the communist paper. So I had that background. And growing up in the 30s, I remember listening in shul to people talking about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia indignantly. And of course, the Spanish Civil War, one of our family friends' son went over, fought. He was an Olympic runner, but he stayed behind in Europe in '36 to join the forces fighting for loyalists against Franco. So it was very much in the air. And then the Second World War and the fight against fascism. And my family, my father's family who had remained behind, were wiped out. His mother, father, 2 sisters and their children. 2 younger brothers of his had come after the First World War, but couldn't get into America because of the quota against so-called East Europeans, meaning Jews, Slavs, Italians, the racist quota system. So they went to Brazil. And I said, why did you go to Brazil? I got to know them ultimately. Oh, there was an uncle. There's always an uncle somewhere. And so they started from scratch, and they settled in Brazil. But that was it. So the Second World War was, what it was. It was the greatest horror and policies to exterminate the Jews, and the most horrendous war in history, I guess. The Germans had 4 million troops in there. In the first year, they killed 1 million Jews and communists in Russia, captured 3 million Russian soldiers, many of whom starved or were beaten or worked to death. So it was gruesome. And that's where I think I became radicalized towards, the struggle against that kind of racism and oppression, so on. Militarism, nationalism.
And during that period, pre-World War II, and the struggle during the Depression of people trying to get an education, to find jobs, to be able to get married, to be able to afford an apartment, so you could get married. These were all the issues that we're kind of, many of our younger people
today.
It gives me the shivers when I think of the parallels.
That's very true, yeah. No, you're right.
In this growing up, I looked at this draft that you allowed me to review, entitled Out of Brownsville, Encounters with Nobel Laureates and Other Jewish Writers, a Cultural Memoir. The list of people that you write about that either you knew personally or included them anyway in your...
Counted briefly.
In one way or another. It's a story of the times.
Yeah.
Alfred Kazin, Norman Potterhertz, Isaac Bashevis, singer, Morty Gunty, Howard Sackler, Grace Paley, and Saul Bellow, goes on and on and on and on. And in this draft, you talk about how they contributed not only to the Jewish cultural movement, but to America.
Yes.
Because America truly was a melting pot in those days, in the sense that, of course, they had to fight, depending on where you came from, they had to fight for recognition and the opportunity to get an education or a job. But tell me about some of these people.
Oh my God. Well, it's interesting you say.
Well, pick one.
Well, let me go back a step. He said, I ultimately began to write. I gave a kind of all-purpose lecture, even to this day. I just gave it in Europe and various places, called it the influence of Jewish American literature upon American literature. So it was a two-way street, obviously, but I wanted to get that in. And I see it as a paradigmatic thing for many of the multi-ethnic and multicultural literatures that we have now, besides African American and his Latino and Native American and Asian. I mean, there's a wealth and riches. And really my point is not to be sectarian and say, oh, Jewish American literature is the be-all and end-all of American life and literature. No, but it was early in the game to break down the homogeneity of the American literary canon and institutional life. It's not just Melville and Hawthorne and all the rest, which are wonderful, and necessary and part of American in a very important way. Mark Twain, we love those people, and Henry James, but there were contributions from other people. And I had a little early collection of essays called how the contribution of Southern writers and Jewish writers from marginalization, from marginal positions to the mainstream. And at the end of that, which I wrote 25, 30 years ago, I said now it's women and African Americans will come into the mainstream as well. And then, of course, all the others. And I think that's a healthy and wonderful thing. So I don't want to be seen just as a sectarian and chauvinistic about Jewish, although I'm very proud of it, and I'm proud of being Jewish. But it's part of that larger mosaic of American life. And that's what I taught a lot. Even though I started out, as many of us did in the 50s, in a very safe and academic, scholarly way, by doing a dissertation on a minor contemporary of Shakespeare's. And my first courses I taught at UMass were metaphysical poetry of the 17th century and Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, which I love. But when I became editor of the Massachusetts Review, I was teaching one course on American literature and Jewish literature, Jewish American, and one course in the 17th century. I couldn't do both. So I told my chairman I'd leave the 17th century. Fortunately, I had tenure, so I could do that. And the Renaissance has not missed me, and I haven't missed them. And I've been very happy doing modern literature and American literature and ethnic literature. So that's my development in the 50s, how I expanded my horizons, as it were, and found myself doing multi-ethnic literatures and American literature, which became, as one of the great teachers I've had was Henry Nash Smith, who was the great Twain scholar. The new book, The Autobiography of Mark Twain, his widow edited at Berkeley. And he said to me once, he says, American studies is a gravy train circling the globe. And that was during the Cold War. They want American. So I got invited often to European, always European universities, and I gave my talks about broadening the canon of American life and literature.
And the Massachusetts Review, which you were one of the
I was one of the founders.
developers.
I'm the last of the Mohicans. I'm the only one left of the original group that founded it.
And we want, I sort of read a few of the gatherings in honor of Jules Chametzky. This is it.
Yeah.
And how many years did you put into that?
Well, that came out, I think, in 1992.
I'll accept that.
I think so. I think. No, 2002. I'm sorry.
Okay.
2002. That's only 9 years ago when I left it for the second time. Although it's been going 50 years, and it's been wonderful. It's extraordinary to last that long.
It's continuing?
It's been continuing for over 50 years, and it has a wonderful. I haven't been involved with it. I had retired from it for the second time in 2002.
Okay.
The first time was in 1974, when I thought it needed a women and feminist orientation. We had done a lot of the African American and civil rights in the 60s, which that book, Black and White American Culture, which Sidney Kaplan and I co-edited. Then I left and to Mel Heath from Amherst College in Mount Holyoke, and Lee Edwards became co-editors with John Hicks and Robert Tucker. And I left happily, and but I was asked to come back to it in, I don't know, 1992. And I did 11 more years, so altogether 27 years. 27 years. And we had a sterling group. I mean, I never learned so much as I did the first 4 years from Sidney Kaplan. Leonard Baskin was the art editor. He had superb art sections, and he's a very learned guy. And then Jerry Liebling came on the scene in '69. He was the first professor they hired when Hampshire College was just a cow pasture. And Jerry and I had known each other at the University of Minnesota in the early '50s. And his pictures, his photographs all throughout, spectacular. And he was a spectacular, so we had wonderful people working on it from the 5 colleges ultimately, and that was very good.
So there's a great wealth of literature and for future generations to tie in terms of the
I think so.
historical perspective
Yeah,
over the
I think
last 75 to 100 years. Tell me about your role in black and white American culture in an anthology from the Massachusetts Review.
10 years.
You co-edited this?
Yes. I had, well, we got involved very early through Sidney Kaplan, who was a wonderful early pioneer in African American studies. Among white scholars, one of the pioneers. And I had become friendly with, bonded with John Hope Franklin, the great black historian in Germany. In 1963, we were both spent a week in a retreat lecturing to German gymnasium teachers about American literature and history. He did, black history. I did Southern literature, including Faulkner, Thomas Wolfe, Richard Wright. We spent 5 or 6 days together, and we bonded. So then, when I was abroad, I had been managing editor under Sidney, whom I learned a lot from. And when he wanted out, he had other business, so he proposed me as editor, and I got elected by the board. So when I came back, John Hicks, a wonderful man, and I were co-editors, and I said, we have to continue dealing. We were one of the very few academic journals that were open to black writers, intellectuals, artists, and to its history and culture. And I said, I knew John Hope Franklin. He was then chairman of the history department at Brooklyn College. And I said, let's go down and meet John Hope. So we did. And I said, we took the train in those days, and asked him to give us some leads, who we should approach and recruit. And that was the beginning of my deep involvement. He gave us names, and one thing led to another. Brought graduates, Sidney, through Sterling Brown, who was a great professor at Howard. We got great graduate students. Mike Thelwell, who has 4 wonderful pieces in that anthology. He had just come from SNCC and came to study at UMass, get an MFA in 1965. Took a class with me, and I learned more from him than he did learn from me. And Esther Terry and her husband, Eugene Terry, and Bernard Bell. So we got great graduate students, and that was a nucleus for the ultimate development of the Afro-American Studies Department in 1969.
How did you meet Lester?
How did I meet Lester? He sent us a story when I was editor. He was in New York then, and I wanted to talk to him about it. There was something about it I wanted clarified. I met him at the Chelsea Hotel. We had a nice talk, and he did what we published, I think, his first fiction. And I don't know whether it was, I think, it was after, no, I know what it was. When that came out, the black and white, in 1969, went through 3 editions, including a Harper Collins paperback in '71. But it went through, he reviewed it in the New York Times, Time gave it a 2-page review. So that's why I went down to Chelsea to meet him. I think it was after that.
Then he came to UMass
Then
eventually.
he came to teach in the Afro. He knew Thelwell. They knew each other from the civil rights movement in the South, because Julius had worked with CORE and Mike had worked with SNCC. But then he left and became a member of the Judaic Studies Department, as well as co-director with me of something called the Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities, which was set up in 1980 till 1991 or 2, when I retired officially. But he was my co-director for 2 years. That's how I got to know him.
In the minute or 2 that we have left.
Is that all? See what I mean?
Well,
it goes fast.
It's going to go pretty fast. Because you're a great guest, and so much more that we can deal with, and we'll come back at another time.
Oh, good.
After this summer, we're both going to take a break.
All right, very
Okay.
good. I'd be glad to come back. It's a pleasure. I mean, it just pours out. I mean, once you press the button.
Tell us about UMass in the remaining minutes or 2.
Oh my, I feel very bad about what's happening with higher education generally, public higher education. The cutbacks, the lack of appreciation for culture, history, arts, literature, languages, you know, the hustling for bucks from I honor science and technology and business, but it seems to take over the whole of higher education, certainly in the public sphere, and then the costs that are passed on to the upper, lower middle class and working class people. I feel it was our duty and our mission to give I got a free education at City University of New York, at Brooklyn College, and a very modest amount of money to go get a PhD at the University of Minnesota, one of the great universities of the country. Our public higher education system was a glory of the world. However much we used to criticize Bush or whatever, American policies, you could be proud of our public higher education system. The envy of the world. And they're letting it go down the tubes. It pains me deeply. And maybe it's just age, I don't know.
No, it's not age, it's wisdom. It's having lived through it.
Putting a good face on it.
But we need more of this. We need to get rid of the obstacles. So many future contributors to society
Absolutely.
are going to miss the boat.
Absolutely. Yep.
It's been great.
Thank you, Isaac. It's been very nice for me too. I hope I didn't take up too much. It wasn't too narcissistic.
No. There's so much more that we can talk about.
Yeah, we could.
But
We could actually.
the important thing is that we're still around, and we have something to leave. Not only in terms of a legacy, but we can still kick ass in our own sort of way.
Well.
And we have to do it because we came out of the fire,
well, we
and
showed
we're
up.
leaving maybe during a
Showed
time
up
of fire.
with friends at the rallies for the Madison workers and teachers and so on. Still doing it, going out on the demonstrations.
Shalom.
Shalom.
It's been a pleasure.
Chava.
Well, I want to thank the staff. I want to thank the volunteer students. This has been an opportunity that I'm glad I've had an opportunity to share with Jules and with the rest of the community. This is Conversations. We'll continue to broadcast as long as we can find people like Jules who have so much to teach us and to say. Good night now. See you next week.